Up next, Walter Isaacson recounts the personal life and professional career of Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple Computers. Mr. Isaacson speaks at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, for about an hour and a half.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Computer History Museum. I'm John Holler, the CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of the trustees and our staff, our members, everybody associated with the museum. We're just absolutely delighted that you're here. I want to thank our good friends at Intel who have sponsored the entire Revolutionary series, Season 1 as we're calling it now, and also Perforce Software, because they both have provided support for this speaker series. And in connection with Revolutionaries, I'm really delighted to announce tonight a fairly significant partnership with KQED. KQED and the Computer History Museum have now partnered to produce a 13-part series that will premiere on public television in January called CHM Presents Revolutionaries. And it's going to be the best of our speaker series, featuring people that you will have seen and heard either personally here at the museum or on our YouTube channel, or on KQED FM, or on C-SPAN. By the way, KQED FM and C-SPAN are both here tonight. This is the lineup that starts January 16th and will go for 13 weeks. Of course, Walter Isaacson, Mark Zuckerberg and David Kirkpatrick with NPR's Guy Raz, IBM Chairman Sam Palmisano, DreamWorks Chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg and CTO Ed Leonard, IBM's David Ferrucci, the inventor of Watson, Paul Allen, Jane McGonigal, the expert in gaming around the world with NPR's Laura Seidel, Pulitzer Prize winner Jane Smiley, journalist Stephen Levy, author of In the Plex, which is essentially the biography of Google, David Hartley of the British Computing Society and a protege of Sir Maurice Wilkes, Mark Bowden, author of Black Hawk Down, who was here with TJ Campana of Microsoft talking about his new book Worm, the first Digital World War with John Markoff. Venture capital legend Bill Draper along with KQED's David Iverson, and Eric Horvitz of Microsoft and Peter Norvig of Google, probably two of the leading AI experts in the world, talking with KQED's Tim Olson. This is quite a lineup. We feel very, very privileged to have had every single one of these people on our stage in the last 12 months. And we are looking forward to kicking off Season 2 in January. So keep an eye on your mailbox, your email, and museum newsletter, because we'll be talking more about the lecture series to come. Now on to our program. It was January 15th, 2008. Steve Jobs was on stage in San Francisco making one of his legendary presentations. The Kindle e-reader comes up, and Jobs said, "This will go nowhere," being uncharacteristically blunt. He said it would go nowhere because Americans have stopped reading. It doesn't matter how good or bad the product is, the fact is that people don't read anymore. 40% of the people in the United States read one book or less last year. The whole concept is totally flawed. Well, if it's true that people only are reading one book this year, we know which book it is. Despite its late arrival on October 28th, shortly after Steve's tragic death, it went immediately to #1 on Amazon, nearly a month before its release, and ever since then it has dominated every bestseller list in many parts of the world. Walter Isaacson has been at this for a while. He is not only, of course, a distinguished journalist, former chairman of CNN, former managing editor of Time Inc., now the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, but next year will mark the 20th anniversary of his first major biography, that of Henry Kissinger. To that, of course, he's added the biographies of Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, and now, of course, this book on Steve Jobs. Walter and I talked a few days ago about opening this evening with something special and featuring items from our landmark collection, which you can see here on stage. Walter's going to introduce them. Aren't they neatly dressed in their black turtlenecks? Don't they look good? They have sneakers on underneath the podium here. And we have about 3,000 items in our collection from Apple. It's one of the largest collections of its kind in the world dealing with Apple. But after Steve died, when we were looking through the collection to find out really what was the best of the best, we discovered something very amazing. It was a videotape that Regis McKenna had made in 1980 of a 25-year-old Steve Jobs making a 22-minute presentation at Stanford on the roots of Apple and his vision for the company. We have digitized that and we've put it on our website at computerhistory.org. It's never been seen before, and we're going to play you about 2 minutes of it tonight, and I hope you'll be as amazed as we were when you see it.
We had absolutely no idea what people were going to do these things when we started out. Matter of fact, the two people it was designed for was Woz and myself, because we couldn't afford to buy a computer kit on the market. So we liberated some parts from Hewlett-Packard and Atari, and worked on a design for about 6 months and decided that we would build our own computer. So we built one, and Woz was up till 4 in the morning for many moons, and we got it working. We showed some of our friends. Immediately everybody wanted one, and it turned out that it took about 40 hours to build one of these things and about another 20, 30, 40 to debug it. And we had a lot of friends that worked at similar companies who could liberate the parts also. And we found ourselves spending every spare moment of our time helping our friends to build computers. And it was just getting to be a tremendous drain on our lives. So we got the idea one day that we could make a printed circuit board without the parts in it, and sell these blank printed circuit boards to our friends and probably cut the assembly and debug time down to, 5, 10 hours. So Woz sold his HP 6 calculator and I sold my van, and we got $1,300 together, and we paid our friend of ours who was this PC board layout person $1,300 to do us a layout, and decided we'd sell printed circuit boards at twice what it cost to build them and hopefully recoup our calculator and transportation at some later date. So that's what we did, and I was out trying to peddle PC boards one day and walked into a byte shop, the first byte shop in Mountain View, and Paul Terrell, the then owner of the byte shop, said he would like to take 50 of these computers. And I saw dollar signs in front of my eyes. But he had one catch, which was that he wanted them fully assembled and tested, ready to go, which is a new twist. So we spent the next 5 days on the phone to distributors and convinced the electronics parts distributors around here to give us about $10,000 worth of parts on thin air, just on enthusiasm. So we got the parts and we built 100 computers and we sold 50 of them for cash, and in 29 days paid off the distributors. And that's how we got started.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Walter Isaacson.
Hey, good to see you, son. How great it is to be here at the Computer
Thank you.
History Museum.
Well, we're
wonderful,
delighted.
Wonderful place. Can I give a shout out to Steve Wozniak, who I just saw, and his wife Joyce? Woz, stand up. Andy Hertzfeld next to him, I think, and so all the history is here. Totally intimidating me, because I'll keep looking over and they'll be nodding or shaking their head. No, it wasn't that way exactly. But so if I look over there, that's for my cues.
This is the Silicon Valley crowd, Walter. They won't be that polite.
Oh dear.
Well, we're so happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Let me ask you about your very, very first meeting with Steve Jobs, 1984. Mm-hmm. You described yourself as junior editor at the time. He comes to New York to demonstrate the Macintosh.
And
how did that go? You
see both sides of Steve. That absolutely passionate side, because there he is with the original Mac, that thing sitting there that almost looks like it's smiling at you. He makes sure that the strip up there, he shows us how thin it is, so it looks like a friendly face, not a Neanderthal face. And he shows us all the graphical icons, and you can tell he's passionate about every pixel. He's also furious at Time magazine, tells us that, we're not nearly as good as Newsweek, that somebody, I won't name his name because he lives here, had written a horrible story about him. And so I saw the petulant side. And that's when I first started to realize that the sort of impatience and petulism that you sometimes saw in Steve Jobs was connected to the passion and the perfectionism.
You were meeting incredible people. You have met incredible people during your career. Was there something special about that encounter? Did he make a particular impression on you at that moment?
I must admit, I was mesmerized by him. He's a very compelling person. I mean, you saw it there. That's what he was then. And he's telling you these stories. He was up for he was mad because he had not been made Man of the Year for the end of 1982. I, of course, have been an idiot on the wrong side of that, and I'd voted for Paul Volcker. None of you remember who Paul Volcker was. But we had done The Machine Moves In. It was sort of Machine of the Year. And so, but you could tell the first time you met Steve Jobs that there was something compelling about him.
So flash forward 20 years, it's 2004, and he gets in touch with you.
Yeah, he gives me a call, and I just joined the Aspen Institute. We talked a little while. I said, do you want to come speak at Aspen? He said, no, but I want to come take a walk with you. And after a while, he says, why don't you do a biography of me? He sort of suggests it. I had done Ben Franklin, was just finishing Albert Einstein. So I thought, okay, you know, Franklin, Einstein, Steve, it's a perfect progression.
I'm sure that was on his mind.
But I admit, I said, you know, you're a really, really great subject, but let's wait 30 years until you retire. And it wasn't until 2009 when he had his liver transplant, went on that medical leave, that it sort of sunk in that he was fighting cancer, that he had transformed with his team a wide variety of industries. You know, first home computing and personal computing, but by that point, by 2009, had transformed the music industry with iTunes and the iPod, the way we listen to music, the phone industry, the publishing industry, tablet computing. So that's when I said, all right, you know, this is too good to pass up.
Did you have a theory about him going into this?
I had a theory because his very first phone call when we started talking about it, he told me something that Edwin Land had said to him, which is that you always want to stand at the intersection of liberal arts and the sciences. You know, right there between the humanities and the humanities and technology or engineering. And that's something we kind of lost in the C.P. Snow era, where, you know, you either were in the humanities or you were in the sciences. And my theory, among others, was that connecting creativity to wonderful feats of engineering was what made him so magical.
You wrote something in the book, just a quote. His passion for perfection led him to indulge his instinct to control. So I want to talk to you about the editorial control question, because you must have had to raise that and settle it fairly early on. How did you manage to do that?
I was stunned because it never really came up. And then after a while, he kept saying, well, it's your book. It's your book. I'm not even going to read it. He did say, by the way, people don't read books, you know. Yeah. So I don't, you know, but it's yours. And by the way, I wanted to be honest. I want you to interview, you know, people who didn't like me as well as people who did. And he said, you know, that he was brutally honest his whole life. He said he did not want it to feel like an in-house book. He wanted it to feel like an independent book, and therefore he was going to exercise no editorial control.
Did that ever change? Did he ever call you up and say,
well,
you know,
the one time he did, which fits into a theory of people don't read books, but they look at them, is Simon & Schuster, about a year ago, put into the catalog sort of a cover design, just that was a placeholder. And it was a cover of Steve and an apple, you know, with Ice Steve as the title. I landed in San Francisco airport coming to a product launch that he was going to do. I can't remember which one, but maybe the iPad. And I saw the thing you least like to see on your iPhone, which is 6 or 7 missed calls from Steve Jobs. So you all know the San Francisco airport. I'm standing there right in the concourse. I hit return, and he just starts yelling at me. He said, you have no taste, you know, and, you know, the title is gimmicky, and it's just ugly, and I don't even want you to come to the demonstration. I'm holding the phone, you know. And finally he says, I'm not going to continue to cooperate unless you allow me to have input into the cover art. Now, it took me somewhere between a second and a half to say, sure. You know, here's the greatest design eye, you know, for something like that. And he spent a lot of time, you know, just trying to make it a very simple, clean cover. And so that was the one time I felt his wrath, and also the one time when he had editorial input.
You know, you talk a lot about, and you quote his friends who coined the term reality distortion field.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself getting sucked into that from time to time as you started working with him?
Well, I think you'd be the last to know. Reality Distortion Field, and Andy writes about it and talked to me about it in Revolution in the Valley, but it was, you know, the engineers there, it comes from a Star Trek series, which is simply by thinking something and being convinced of something, even if it's impossible, you know, you can convince other people. And then the secret of the Reality Distortion Field is that it sometimes works, that you convince people they can do the impossible. Woz talked about that to me and in his own book about, you know, Steve saying, you'll have to do this in 4 days. I think it was, you know, one of the Atari games they were doing. And Woz said, it can't be done. And Steve said, you can do it. And that was the Reality Distortion Field, and 4 days later it had been done. So the question of whether I got sucked into it, I found myself deeply emotionally vested with him. I tried very hard to be honest in the book, to put all things and all sides in the book. But there were I mean, this will be people in this audience, they will know more than, you know, most. If you read the book and say, boy, this guy got caught in the Reality Distortion Field, I guess the answer would be yes.
So one final question about the process of writing the book, and then we'll move on to sort of the substance of Steve. You had the luxury of a kind of long historical detachment from Einstein, from Benjamin Franklin, not so much with Kissinger. But here you are suddenly writing a biography of a very compelling living person, up close and personal with him in 40 interviews. How does a biographer maintain that kind of necessary detachment that you could enjoy just by not being able to spend time with Einstein or Franklin?
Well, a couple of things. You know, when Steve did his Stanford speech, he said, let me tell you 3 stories. That's it, just 3 stories. You become a storyteller. You don't try to preach. And I just tried to let the stories tell themselves. One of the things I discovered by having so much time with him and so much time with 150 other people who worked with him was how much more we know, or I could know about him than I did about Benjamin Franklin or Einstein. And we think, you know, Benjamin Franklin wrote a lot of letters, 40 volumes of papers. Einstein, they're still compiling his papers, so we should know more. But like the flying the kite in the rain, you know, we got one little journal entry where there's maybe a newspaper clip. But with Steve, everything that happened, I'd hear about it at great length and then hear other people's versions of it. And I probably ended up knowing 100, maybe 1,000 times more about him and each story in the book than you would doing somebody who you're doing it through letters or journals.
Okay. Let's talk about the storytelling now. And the place I'd like to begin is his partnership with Wozniak.
It starts with that
very
thing right
early
there.
days. Yeah.
The Blue Box.
Right.
Well, it starts at Atari, actually, doing games where Steve is on the night shift because they find it easier to work with him if he's on the night shift. And he learns a lot at Atari, including the notion of how to juice up chips and make them do amazing things, and also simplicity. I mean, you have to remember that games like Pong and Breakout and Star Trek, they had to be so simple that a stoned freshman could figure them out, you know. So it was like the instructions were insert quarter, avoid Klingons or something. And so that simplicity got embedded in him. Then at one point, you have one of the few copies at the Computer History Museum of the Blue Box, which was started, I think, when Esquire magazine wrote about Captain Crunch and the phone phreakers who could replicate the Bell system's tones and thus make free phone calls. And so Woz and Steve Jobs said, we got to do this. Went to SLAC, the Stanford Linear Accelerator, you know, library there, found the Bell system manuals, and made an analog version of that didn't quite work. Woz goes off to Berkeley, but in his first semester there is able to make the first digital version of it. And there you see the partnership. And fortunately, I can't see Woz, whether he's shaking his head or not. But Woz comes up with this amazing circuit board, but of course, you know, loves to show it off. Steve says, we can package it and we can sell it and make money. So they start going door to door in rooms in Berkeley selling this thing. At one point, testing it out by, I think, calling the Vatican, and Woz pretended to be Henry Kissinger, saying that he was at a summit meeting and needed to speak to the Pope. I can see Woz is nodding at this one. As far as I can tell, they never really got the Pope on the phone, that the entire College of Cardinals was smart enough eventually to figure out it was not Henry Kissinger calling. But, you know, they showed the thing off, and Steve told me when he described that story and the whole Blue Box story that if it hadn't been for the Blue Box, it wouldn't have been Apple.
That's pretty profound. And why did he feel that way? What was the thing that they could do together that made
They're
Apple
very
happen?
complementary, meaning they complemented each other well. I mean, he would say of Woz that he could, 50 times better than any engineer, could have meetings in his head and design great circuit boards. Woz had been taught by, you know, his father, being an engineer is the highest calling, so he never thought about, maybe we should put it in a package, maybe we should get, you know, great case, maybe we should get a good power supply and integrate it, and maybe we can sell it at twice or 3 times the cost of our materials. And so what Steve did was, as he did his whole life, take really great ideas and come up with a great vision and pull it all together to do something amazing. And I think that was a perfect partnership for somebody who was, you know, could design a circuit board with 1/4 of the number of chips that any other engineer would take to make it work.
Well, we were talking earlier, too, about the process of invention is not a singular endeavor. It's not the one person sitting in a room finding out that aha.
We were talking about the Jane Smiley book, to be honest.
Yeah. It really is about, it's about that collaboration. Have you, when you think of Einstein, for example, was there a relationship? Have you found through history and as a journalist that these kinds of relationships recur over and over? You find Wozniak and Jobs, you find other people who are...
No, not always. With Einstein, it was a true solo act, especially the greatest of, most elegant of theories of the 20th century, general relativity. He's pacing alone in his apartment in Berlin for months on end. And unlike most other physicists at the time, Max Planck, Niels Bohr, he didn't form a school and wasn't collaborative. Steve, even though he was sometimes tough on people, truly created teams, like the original Macintosh team, of which Andy was a part, that were bonded together as if they were pirates in a pirate band. And Steve was able, with his both inspiring way and demanding way, to create collaborative teams. And he's done that, he did that his whole life. I mean, even now, for the past 8 or 9 years at Apple, you've had an intensely loyal, great collaborative team.
So Apple gets up and running.
They start with, just so I can give a shout out to every one of your wonderful products.
Introduce all our friends here.
Yeah, the Apple I, showing that that was what you heard on the tape, where they go purvey it to Paul Terrell at the Byte Shop. It gets up and running when they create that circuit, when Woz creates a circuit board and then they put it all together. Steve decides they have to incorporate. In fact, they sold today at Sotheby's for $1.some-odd million.
See that, $1.6 million.
Yeah, what Ron Wayne, Steve Jobs, and Wozniak signed when they put together Apple. The way Steve tells me the story, he had worked on the All One Farm, a commune run by people at Reed College, where they had all dropped out of Reed, gone to this apple farm. He was there tending to the Gravenstein apples, and had come back from the apple farm and says, okay, we're going to create a company. And they, you know, it gets all excited that, you know, not only are we going to make a product, we'll have our own company. And they couldn't figure out what to name it. And they have all sorts of Executrex and Matrix and Personal Computers, Inc. But Steve says, what about just Apple? Apple Computer. Counterintuitive. Makes your head snap a bit. But kind of friendly. Has a whiff of the counterculture, but it's also, it's as American as pie. And I think says, if we can't think of a better name within a day, we'll register it as Apple Computer. And then he said, and by the way, it'll get us in front of Atari in the phone book.
It's an important marketing angle. So They began to work on the Apple I. Apple is growing. They're putting together this team early in the early history of the post-incorporation period. But there's another ingredient that has to come along to make it work, right? Mike Markkula comes onto the scene.
Well, first of all, you need money.
Right.
Because what they're doing is going from the Apple I to the Apple II. If you notice among the differences, Jerry Manick and others create, it wasn't Manick, but create a beautiful case. They need the plastic molding. It's going to cost a lot of money to do it. You can't just sell your VW bus and your HP calculator the way they did to get the money for the Apple I. So they need investment capital, and Mike Markkula comes along, signs a line of credit, but also gives them a great piece, or gives Steve a great piece of advice, which is a marketing document with 3 concepts on it. One is to focus, really, keep your focus. The other is empathy. Not the perfect word for it, but it's basically make an emotional connection with the people who are going to buy your products. And then the third is also not a great word. The word's impute, but it means cast an aura around whatever you do so that the minute Steve, even throughout his career, had his own personal name on the patents for the boxes, the packaging of the Apple product. So when you opened up and there was that iPod cradled, it imputed that it was something really cool, just the way the Apple II does. It imputes that it's a really cool machine.
Well, and even as primitive as it looks to us today, he obsessed with the curve of the corners on the edges.
The chamfers and all the design elements. He had been fascinated by the Sony style. And right when they move out of the garage, they're in sort of a little office. And next door is a Sony showroom. And he would fondle the brochures. Then he went to Aspen Design Conference. He got invited. And really, having grown up in a Joseph Eichler house, and I know Joseph Eichler's grandson is here selling the books with Kepler, but those Eichler homes were sort of mass-marketed, simple Frank Lloyd Wright style homes for the everyman. But it was simplicity. And it was that Bauhaus style of make it simple, but the simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And so clean, white, simple, that becomes the style for Apple.
It's about this time as Apple grows as a company, the Apple II takes off, they're selling hundreds of thousands of units. The phrase in the book surfaces, temperamental and bratty.
Yeah.
And it seems at this point there's a kind of breakout, a very particular kind of breakout at this point where that side of Jobs, that sort of very petulant, I think is the word you use a lot, temperamental and bratty is how other people described it, and it starts to grate on people, right? I think you're right.
Well, he was temperamental. I mean, that's why he was on the night shift at Atari. Sure. This wasn't something new, but temperamental people also have the temperament of an artist, which is why you have a passion to have end-to-end control of a product and make it perfect. That temperamentalness, there was an original president, Mike Scott. Scotty sort of tried to temper Jobs and didn't work too well. Eventually they bring in John Scully, who's a very polite gentleman, to try to, handle Steve. But with Steve, you got the whole package. Right. The temperamentalness was a part of it. And it showed just in how he cared. Even, I tell the story in the book with Steve walking me by his house that he grew up in, the house when he was very young. And his dad, he built a fence with his dad, and he showed me the fence, and we touched it. And he said, my dad taught me to make the back of the fence as beautiful as the front. And I asked my dad why. Nobody will ever see it. Nobody will ever know. And my dad said, but you will know. And that's why even on the Apple II, he wants a circuit board to be beautiful. And when they get to the Macintosh, the next one over, even though you cannot open it, he holds it up for a while because the chips on the circuit board are not neatly aligned. And when they say, but nobody can open it, nobody will know, he says to the Mac designers, but you will know. And the other thing that's interesting, talking about Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs, and those two things, is Steve Jobs had the passion of an artist to have end-to-end control. Hardware, integrated with software, don't open it up. Woz's view was much more open, that we could license out the software, but on the Apple II, I think it had 8 slots. You could jack into it, you could put stuff into it, you could open it up, you could get to the circuit board. And Steve Jobs was against having slots. He wanted, as an artist would, he wouldn't want Bob Dylan saying, let's have an open source on my lyrics, everybody can put the words they want. He didn't like people jacking and opening up. Woz kind of insists that he wants the Apple II to have these jacks, the slots, but the Macintosh doesn't. And the Macintosh doesn't even have screws that you can use to open it up. And that was very Steve Jobs-like, all the way through his career, really believing and tightly controlling, like the gardens of Kyoto that he loved to visit, carefully curated, carefully walled, carefully tended by one artist's sensibility.
So let's move now to the Macintosh era. So much is going on at Apple at that point. There's so much growth. And his personal courtship of John Sculley begins. Can you talk a little bit about that on-again, off-again relationship?
It was a bad mistake. It was almost like he saw John Sculley a bit as a father figure or a mentor. Sculley really wanted to be cool and hip and wanted Steve's approval. And it was, for a while, the famous line, I think it's at the San Remo apartment that Steve is thinking of buying, and he brings John Sculley up in New York. They're looking over Central Park, and Sculley's demurring. And Steve says, do you want to spend the rest of your life, because Sculley was at Pepsi, selling sugar water, or do you want to change the world? And so Sculley comes, and Sculley is a man of prep school sensibilities, great manners, very kind, but it's hard for him to deal with conflict. Steve felt the price, I'd say, why were you so tough? He said, well, the price of admission to being with me is that I got to be able to tell you you're full of it. Actually, use a word with 2 more letters than it. And you got to be able to tell me I'm full of it, and we're going to really duke it out. And Sculley was not that way. Secondly, Sculley was basically a marketer. And having run Pepsi US, he didn't sit there worrying about the product. He was not fiddling with the formula for Doritos and saying, I can make this insanely great, this Dorito. It was shelf space marketing. And I think Steve, after a while, felt that Sculley just didn't get into how awesome the Mac was. And then it didn't help that the Mac, even though it was insanely great, Sculley priced it at almost $2,500. It did not sell very well. Microsoft started licensing out its copied version of the graphical user interface and started dominating the computer business. And so I think their relationship was doing fine as long as Apple was doing fine. And the Apple II was a workhorse. It was making the money for the company. But the Mac didn't. And so there was a horrible falling out that culminates on Memorial Day of 1985.
Before we talk a little bit more about the falling out in the post-85 period, let's talk about the invention of the Macintosh itself, the design itself. And this is a point in the book where you insert the great famous quote from Jobs: "Good artists copy, great artists steal," which he took from Picasso. And then he would add, "And we have always been shameless about stealing great ideas." That quote is often associated with the genesis of the Macintosh because of Xerox PARC and the graphical interface.
So they take 2 visits to Xerox PARC. And as you know, Xerox had come up with the concept of the desktop metaphor, the graphical interface. More importantly, sort of a bitmap design, meaning each pixel on that screen could be mapped to bits in the microprocessor. And so you could make a beautiful machine. You and I are old enough to remember, and certainly if you're not, you can go into this museum here, to remember when you have to do, those green phosphor letters, C prompts with C:, \, whatever command. It was god awful. And suddenly, at Time magazine, we get the Mac, and you can click and the document appears. You can drag and drop. Well, so I do a whole big section on both the visits to Xerox PARC, and I think the misconception that they just took the graphical interface from Xerox PARC. Because it takes 2 years of the most amazing designers, including Andy and others on the team, to take the metaphor that Xerox used and to really make it great. You have to remember, Xerox came out with the Star 2 years before the Mac came out. I think it sold like 7 copies in all of America. I mean, it was a kludgy, bad machine. What they did when they took that metaphor was say, oh, we'll take the mouse with 3 buttons and totally simplify it. And you'll be able to click and drag and drop and double click and open things up. We'll invent pull-down menus. And Bill Atkinson invents, clipping, where you can have documents sort of looking like they're on top of other documents, so it looks like a messy desktop where you can do things. So none of that was in the Xerox original graphical interface. So I think, first of all, they take the Xerox metaphor and actually make it insanely great. Secondly, T.S. Eliot's line, there falls the shadow between the conception and the reality. Well, they were able to execute on it, which Xerox and others weren't. But it is true that part of Steve's genius was looking at 1,000 ideas at any given point and saying that one's great, and this one sucks, and this we're going to ignore, but pulling together ideas, including ideas from Xerox PARC.
And this is one of the times where he's pushing this team incredibly hard. I mean,
reality distortion field is then coined by, at one point, one of the engineers, I think Larry Kenyon is his name, is in charge of the boot up of the machine. And Steve says it's taking too long to boot up. You got to shave 10 seconds off the boot up time. Reality distortion field. The guy says, you can't. It's actually a really elegant piece of code. I can't shave 10. And Steve says, if you could save a human life, would you shave 10 seconds off? And Kenyon goes, well, yeah. So Steve goes to a piece of whiteboard or whatever and says, all right, say there are 1 million Macintoshes, and say it's 10 seconds every time somebody boots up. And in a given year, it's done this number of times. And he multiplies it out and says, you can save this number of lives every year if you shave off 10 seconds. An example of the reality distortion field working? Within 4 weeks, Larry Kenyon had shaved off 28 seconds. Everything about that. You see the screen? It's a rounded rectangle. I think it's Bill Atkinson. I'll get corrected if I get some of the names wrong, but I think it's Atkinson, who's doing what's called the primitives that you can easily put on the screen. So he does a square, which is easy, and a rectangle. And then he does a circle, which is hard because the microprocessor doesn't do square roots, but he figures out a way to do a circle. And Steve says, yeah, but you need not only a rectangle and a circle, but a rectangle with rounded edges. The guy says, well, no, that can't be done, and why do we need it? And Steve makes him walk around the parking lot in the neighborhood, pointing to things like windshields and billboards and no parking signs and screens of computers, saying rounded rectangles are what people see every day. They're more beautiful to look at. Atkinson came up with a primitive to do a rounded rec. And even, those thin pinstripes on the pull-down menus, Steve fretted over them. Even the Susan Kerr doing the fonts. Steve was there because he had taken that calligraphy course when he dropped out of Reed, caring about the spacing on each one of those fonts.
The perfection that he was seeking at that point, and the almost impossible tasks he was asking people to perform, engendered in the book, as you report it, two completely different camps, it seems to me, of people who worked for Jobs at that point. There were the people who, like Bud Tribble, who says he'd push you, you'd be better for it.
Right.
And
Bud was one of the great engineers on the team.
And then there are others who say, worst experience of my life. If you balance, not only in this case, but in other cases too, the number of people you encountered who felt one way, tremendous affection, and the number of people who felt another way, what would you say that there's a...
Well, there are actually 3 categories, because there are a lot of people who felt both.
Yeah, yeah.
That It was a really agonizing experience and the best experience. But especially with the Macintosh team, or even with the team today, the overwhelming number say, he pushed me to do things I never thought I could do. He drove me nuts at times. It was the greatest experience in my life.
So it premieres. It's a great commercial, the legendary commercial. Talk a little bit about his view of the creation of the 1984 commercial.
Well, the 1984 ad is interesting because in Steve Jobs' soul, you do have the heart or soul of a member of the counterculture, a rebel, a misfit. In fact, even the Think Different ads start with, here's to the rebels, the misfits, those who think different. The 1984 ad is, I think, an incredible cultural landmark and icon. Obviously, because of the Orwell novel, we had been thinking up until then of computers as being centralizing and controlling and the province of the Pentagon and the power structure and big corporations. The notion that a computer could be personal and empowering to the individual had grown up a bit in opposition to that, sort of the Stuart Brand Whole Earth catalog of view of computers for the people. And Steve was in that mentality. He also liked to think of himself as part of the hacker ethos. Now, the problem with him thinking of himself as a hacker ethos is, as I said, he doesn't want slots. He doesn't want it to be open. He doesn't want you to be able to hack in. So in some ways, he's violated the hacker ethos by creating an appliance that you can't open up, as opposed to, hey, put your own software in here and plug things in. But he wants to assert that I'm still part of that hacker ethos fighting, you know, the establishment. And that's that amazing ad. Ridley Scott, who had just done Blade Runner, films it in London. And it's, you know, the woman being chased by the thought police and all the droids are there, and Big Brother's on the screen droning, and she finally throws the hammer and it decimates Big Brother. And then it says, Apple will introduce Macintosh, find out why 1984 won't be like 1984. So they show it at a board meeting, and all the board members are like this at the end. I think it was Phil Schlein of Macy's, California, finally says, who makes a motion that we find a new ad agency? Scully is so frightened of it, he decides he's going to order them to sell back the advertising time on the Super Bowl and not run the ad. Steve is furious, and at one point shows the ad to Woz, and Woz says, why don't we just chip in and pay for the ad? They don't really, on the Super Bowl, they don't really need to, because Lee Clow and the wonderful people who are what becomes Chiat Day, or it changes its name every few years, who had made the ad. Lee Clow, a beach bum of a brilliant genius who had helped do the ad and been a guru of advertising at Apple ever since, sort of says, we can't sell the time back. They just sort of defy and just somehow don't sell the time back. So the ad runs really only once, or once nationally, but it becomes, by many estimates, including TV Guide and Advertising Age, the best advertisement of all time.
It doesn't sell well.
Yay. We should show it. Yeah, you have it here.
We can't get the rights to show it.
It's on YouTube.
I know, and it shouldn't be on YouTube, but it is anyway. We can play it off YouTube. John, why don't you try to bring that up? So, wonderful commercial, great premiere, doesn't sell well. Steve's removed from running the Macintosh division. That begins the end, right?
Correct.
For him, his relationship with Scully. There's a massive blow up at the end. In fact, you go in the book day by day.
7 days in May.
That fateful week in May.
And just talking to everybody there. And Steve twice during that week tries a counter coup, brings people up to his house in Woodside. They all sort of plot, but they know that Steve probably should not take over the company. And it's one of the great learning experiences, but he feels abandoned. And he's, he was going through a period of wondering, because he had been adopted, about abandonment and father figures. And he has on the board, Arthur Rock, who had been a father figure, Mike Markkula, been a father figure, John Scully, and they all go around the room and vote against him and abandon him. And he really, takes it hard.
How does he recover from that? I mean, when he talked to you about that period, pretty dark time, what did he say?
Well, he described vividly every single day of that week, including where, the food came from when he was serving it on the patio when they're trying to bring Mike Markkula around. So, it's still seared into his mind.
And this is almost 25 years
later. This is Memorial Day weekend of 1985. He goes to Europe for a while, bicycles around with he then talks to some people and comes up with the concept of doing Next Computer. And by the end of '85, has recruited a handful of people from Apple, causing a lawsuit. I mean, this is really bad at this point, because the board and Scully and all think, okay, you're stealing our people. And he creates Next. He says in his Stanford speech, and he said to me, being fired at Apple was the best thing that happened to me. It liberated me. It helped me change. I actually think it was the experience at Next that in some ways liberated him and matured him more.
Why was that?
Well, at Next, there was no board of directors sitting on him. There was no CEO brought in. He could indulge every instinct. So his instinct for design, he gets Paul Rand, the grand old designer of logos, so I think $100,000 just to do the Next logo before they even have anything. He gets, a beautiful headquarters with a patented staircase. You can see them now in Apple stores, but everything had to be, he wanted his own factory. He wanted the Next to be a perfect cube, and those of you who have been involved in computer manufacturing know, usually there's sort of a draft angle that means it's 91 degrees or so that you can actually pull it out of the mold. If it's exactly 90 degrees, it's harder to get, no, exactly 90 degrees. And it meant they had to do a special manufacture. It had to be matte black. Everything about it was, him indulging this insane drive for perfection, including building the factory, having it in pure white, and having it be robotic. So it is a glorious machine that's an absolute market failure. And at the very first Macintosh offsite, he does a series of maxims on the whiteboard. And the first one is, don't compromise. That's a great, inspiring maxim. It's also not really a great way to run a business. As Ben Franklin said, compromisers may not make great heroes, but they do make great democracies. At a certain point, you have to learn how to make trade-offs. And that don't compromise mentality, he had it for a while until he finally realized you don't have to compromise your principles, but you have to have some sense of balance. And that's what he learned at Next.
And simultaneously was doing Pixar.
Pixar is a wonderful example of what we said at the very beginning, the intersection of art and technology. A friend of his had brought him up to George Lucas's, to meet some of George Lucas's people. Lucas was getting rid of the digital animation software and hardware division he had. Steve thought that was really cool. He thought he could make for consumers the ability to do digital rendering. That never really took off, but there was one guy working there who was in charge of making shorts to show off how cool the machines were, named John Lasseter. And he made a couple of shorts with a Luxor lamp and then one called Tin Toy, and the rest, as they say, is biography, if not history. Makes one, eventually at least, a Toy Story. So Pixar becomes a transformative thing in the animation business.
Now he says something very profound to you in the book about that period, which is the strain that running Pixar and Next simultaneously put on him physically. And he even says, I think that had something to do with my eventually getting cancer.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think you get cancer from working hard or stress. Well, I mean,
but it was a period when
he felt that way, and he felt there was great stress. He was driving up to Pixar. He was, handling, and then, of course, when he goes back to Apple, he's juggling quite a few things. I think that that was a time of great stress in his life, and also some unhappiness. Next is not doing very well. Those machines aren't selling. And Pixar you have to remember, it was a hardware-software company, and nobody's buying the Pixar, except for Disney, bought a few Pixar imaging machines, but you know, it's not selling that well. And so for a while, he's hemorrhaging money at both companies.
And also, one of the most wildly creative periods too, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
Pixar was producing these phenomenal...
Well, by the time they produce Toy
films.
Story, they're no longer hemorrhaging money.
Right, yeah.
So.
Did he long for Apple during this period? Did he ever really fully give up on the notion that somehow he would
Apple
go
was
back?
his baby.
Yeah.
Apple was his child. I don't know that he just longed for it, but he was deeply frustrated that it was being screwed up. That after a while they weren't inventing new products and the products sucked, and they kept just coming out with more lines of Macintoshes but not a better machine. They couldn't even create an operating system, you know, a new Mac OS. And so I think he's watching as people screwed up the wonderful baby it helped create.
And finally it leads to his triumphant return.
Well, because they can't create an operating system, at a certain point, Gil Amelio, who is then running Apple, says, okay, I got to buy an operating system. And he looks at the BOS, which was Jean-Luc Yassé's. He looks at even Microsoft, the question of adopting Windows. That would have been weird. And then there's this amazing operating system that Avi Tevanian and Steve Jobs had done it next with a Unix kernel to it, which is exactly what Apple needed. And so eventually Apple decides they have to buy NeXT to get the operating system. But you buy NeXT to get the operating system, you also buy NeXT to get Steve Jobs. And as, I'm not sure it was Woz who said it, but I think it was, Gil Amelio meets Steve Jobs, game over, and soon Steve Jobs was back in the saddle
Well,
again.
in fact, you tell that whole story.
Yeah.
Amelio tried to resist that, but he just found himself
Game over.
being drawn in.
Yeah.
The reality distortion field kicks
Yeah.
in. And then begins, maybe, arguably, one of the greatest decades that any corporation has ever
Totally
had.
stunning. First of all, he creates, you know, with the new operating system, he brings Bill Gates, his doppelganger, his part of the binary star system. He had falling outs and, you know, love-hate relationship. Gates comes back, makes an investment, starts making Microsoft Word and Excel and others for the new Mac OS. But he also truly focuses on design. Y'all remember, and you probably have it here, but not on stage, the first iMac. I mean, he meets Johnny Ive when he first goes back to Apple in 1997, and they form this bonding, and they create the iMac. You know, Johnny Ive sketches it out. Looks almost like a rabbit that has hopped upon your desk. Steve says, that's not good, but they keep playing with the model until they have it beautiful. They make it translucent beyond the blue. They even go to jelly bean factories to say, how do you make it look right? It lets you see the circuit board inside to see how neat that circuit board is. And Johnny Ive even comes up with the notion, even though it's a big desktop machine, of putting a recessed handle. And the engineers say, well, that's going to cost too much money. You don't need a handle. Why would you want a handle? You're not supposed to pick it up. And what Steve and Johnny intuitively understood was that computers were still intimidating to people. But the handle gives you permission to touch it. It says, I'm at your service. And so just by having that recessed handle, even if you didn't use it, you felt that the computer was being deferential to you. So that beautiful design, when they finally have flat screens, they take the iMac and Johnny designs something with the, and Steve says, no, 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 integrity to the flat screen, you've screwed it up. And he goes home. Johnny comes back to to Steve's house. In the backyard, Lorene has planted all these sunflowers. They walk around trying to figure out what to do, and finally you get that beautiful iMac that's just a little dome with the sunflower neck so that it has integrity to it. And everything they do, whether they're playing with plastic or titanium or metals, it's distinguishing Apple from those commodity machines that Dell and HP and Compaq were churning out.
So once he rights the ship with that strategy when he goes back, he makes a kind of incredibly bold decision, which is
2001, yeah.
It's not going to be a computer company anymore.
You know, they used to take the top 100 and go off on retreats and say, here's what we want to do next. And everybody would fight to get on that list, and finally they'd get the list to 10, and then Steve would cross off the bottom 6 or 7 and say, you know, we can only do 4. And it was stay focused. When he went back to Apple, that was it. Focus on, you know, 4 things: desktop, laptop, home, professional. We're not going to make 20 lines of Macs. We're going to make 4. And so that focus. But then when he nails it and he gets that right, at the top of the list is maybe consumer devices, products. And what he does is he realizes that by having end-to-end control of the hardware and the software, you can create a digital hub where you can put your video camera by FireWire, connect it to your computer, and manipulate your video, create DVDs. The one thing he screwed up slightly was he wanted a tray slot in the new iMac, and he was furious when he wanted one of those, you know, pure slots. And when they put a tray in, he was furious, and he made him eventually change it to just a slot. But it meant you couldn't burn music CDs when Panasonic and others came out with the burning of CDs. And he was so focused, the notion of focus, 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 he was focused on video. So they're doing iDVD and that sort of thing. He calls up Adobe and says, you've got to make your, you know, video editing software for the new Mac OS. And unlike Bill Gates, who said yes and came down and made Microsoft for it, the people at Adobe said, no, you got too small of a market share. And as you know, he never quite forgave Adobe, which is why Flash doesn't work on your iPad. But the mark of a true genius of a company is not just when you think of things first, but when you actually fail to think of something first, can you leapfrog? Can you catch up? And so he realizes he had gotten aced out of the music business, that others were making CD burner trays, and all of us were making, downloading music from Napster and making playlists and burning CDs, and you couldn't really do it that well on the Apple. So he had to leapfrog. And he says, we're going to do it by making a perfect end-to-end thing with the jukebox software, which is iTunes, the store in which you get your music, the device itself. And when they start making the iPod, he makes it so simple because it's end-to-end integrated with the whole thing. You can take some of the complexity and put it on the Mac or put it in the iTunes software so that the device itself is not one of these complicated MP3 players where you had to figure out how to do it. You could just look at it with that tracked wheel, and it was intuitive. And he kept saying, I want to be able to get to wherever I want, whatever song I want, whatever function I want, in 3 clicks. And I want it to be intuitive. And he drove him and drove him and drove him until the iPod becomes perfect. And that's when he leapfrogs and does the music. But it takes Apple from being Apple Computer, they even changed the name to just Apple, into being in the digital hub business. First, with DVDs and video, then really big with the iPod and music. And the iPod is hugely successful, so he starts to worry what's going to kill it. And he realizes people putting music on their phones will kill it. So focuses and does the iPhone, and does it at first. They do 2 versions of the iPhone. One with sort of an iPod modified with a tracked wheel, which wasn't very good for a phone. And then with Johnny Ive, many other people, and goaded on by Microsoft and an engineer there that Steve didn't like, this notion of a touchscreen technology. And when he finally sees how the touchscreen can work, he says, that does it. That's how we're going to do the iPhone. And so you have a series of consumer devices from the decade beginning in 2001, most prominently the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad, that totally transform industries.
And at the same time, he's bending other industries in the direction of his vision.
The music industry.
Right? The music industry, Disney,
retail stores.
Retailers.
He can't abide the fact that he's making these insanely great products and they're being sold in big box stores, by clerks who have no idea what they're doing. So he comes up with the notion of the Apple Store, which is not just a store, but a whole branding exercise. And, it just, that notion of bending industries. For the iPod and iTunes Store to work, you had to convince 7 record companies to put all their music on and disaggregate albums and sell the songs instead of the album. Sell the songs for 99 cents initially. And none of the music companies quite went. They had their own press play, and they were doing their consortia. Obviously, Sony was trying to, they'd done the Walkman. They had a great music division. None want to come aboard. And Steve, personally, is like bringing the iTunes software to the Time Warner building, showing it to Roger Ames at Warner Music, getting him aboard, and then getting, Doug Morris at Universal, finally encircling Sony. No other CEO would have been so passionate about just, going at people until they finally surrendered, and Sony's the last holdout. There's a great story Andy Lack and others told me. Andy Lack was running Sony Music at the time. He has to surrender. He has to put Sony Music in. But the one thing that Steve wants is all of Dylan. Because he and Woz in the early days had found every bootleg tape. They had totally Dylan fanatics. It's a soundtrack of Steve's life. Dylan is a Sony artist. So he wants to do all 772 tracks of Dylan as a virtual digital set that you can buy for $199. Andy Lack at Sony says, no, I'm going to jab it to him because I need leverage. We're not going to allow Dylan to be on. Steve calls Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, with all due respect to one of the great artists at the time, slightly spacey, so doesn't quite deal with it, but sort of his manager, they're all trying to figure out, Steve Jobs talking him into it. Andy Lack finally says to Bob Dylan, I will write you a check for $1 million if you'll stay out of the iTunes store with that box set for a year. And Dylan, I hate to say it because I love Dylan, takes the money. But a year later, Andy Lack has moved out of Sony, and Dylan's box set not only goes on to the iTunes store, Dylan does an iPod ad, you may remember, with silhouettes, and Dylan wearing the cowboy hat. And you know what? It helps Dylan more than it even helps the iPod. For the first time since 20 years, he debuted with an album at the top of the Billboard charts. Because iTunes and the iPod had such a cachet that him just doing that ad introduced him to a new generation. You look skeptical about some of those questions.
I'm not skeptical. These are actually a lot of excellent questions. My expression is meant to say, where do I start? But let me just ask you one other question before we get into the cards, which is about the final chapter. You write, if reality did not comport with his will, he would ignore it, as he had done with the birth of his daughter and would do years later when first diagnosed with cancer. I think when I talk to people about the question they most wanted me to ask you tonight, easily in the top 3 was, why, when he was first diagnosed, did he undertake all these other natural, non-medical solutions?
There are 2 sides, at least, to Steve Jobs at all times, whether it's his personal life, cancer, professional life, and the products he made. There's the counterculture, sort of alternative, romantic sensibility of Steve, and there's the hardcore engineering, scientific side of Steve. And the cancer was no different. Both sides kick in, and he spends a lot of time wrestling with those 2 alternatives, wrestling, with alternative treatments and diets, but also, as I say in the book, it didn't, get as much, having his DNA sequenced, having targeted therapies done. Now, unfortunately, it takes some months before he does what he does in every other aspect of his life, is find the perfect synthesis of, something that is both very scientific but also comports with his alternative view of things. And so he does. It takes longer. I don't know. It was implied that had he gotten operated on right away or something, he might have stopped the cancer. We don't know that. I mean, cancer spreads in mysterious ways. So it's quite likely the cancer had already spread. But it was somewhat typical of Steve to say, the normal rules don't apply to me. I'm going to look at this from both an alternative viewpoint as well as a deeply rooted scientific viewpoint. Everything in some ways that he does in his life ends up being a synthesis of that hippie rebel with the guy who was in the Hewlett-Packard Geek Explorers Club.
It's interesting. I'm going to start with a couple of these questions now. What was the greatest misperception about Steve Jobs in your mind that was addressed, or maybe that you could address in this book?
I think the greatest misperception, and came right when the book first came out and people were quickly reading it and pulling out anecdotes, is that the petulance and the impatience that were inbred into his character from the very beginning was just sort of a weird thing. Instead of part of his own personality was integrated, including with his profession and the products he made, just like Apple products are integrated. So that perfectionism and artist temperament, or bratty temperament, you call it artist or bratty temperament, that's not some disconnected little thing that has nothing to do with the passion for perfection or the product, drive that he had. And so I try, and that's what the last chapter is about, to show how all of this was woven together.
So the words like petulant and bratty are also maybe a little euphemistic for some other much stronger words that you use in the book from time to time. Or that
he uses it. I remember, I was at Time Inc., and at one point, Fortune was doing a story involving his cancer, because they were the ones who reported the cancer treatment first, not my book, and other things. And Steve was furious and called up the editor and the editor-in-chief. I was there and heard the stories. And finally he says to Andy Serwer, the editor of Fortune, "Wait a minute, so what do you have here? You've discovered I'm an asshole? Why is that news?" So he was very self-aware that he could be a strong cup of tea.
Yeah. This is an interesting question. Did he have to be who he was in that way? To do what he did?
That's the question I'm most asked. Did you have to be that way? Andy asked me to ask, did you have to be that way to get done what you did? And I'm going to back off a little from giving you a great answer, because I'm a storyteller. I had to write about the person who was in front of me. That's who he was, so I wrote the story of him. This is not a how-to book. This is not a manual for, do you have to be this way to run a company? Well, of course you don't. They're very nice people who run very successful companies, and they're also total assholes who are total failures at running companies. That said, I am not trying to say, here's the way to do it like Steve did. I am trying to write a book about a flesh and blood human being who I didn't know all of his aspects, but when I knew them, I tried to tell that story. And part of that story is being driven, or that's euphemistic. And had he not been that way, I doubt he would have been as successful. On the other hand, I suspect there were other ways to get things done at times. But, when you say, did he have to be that way, my only job is to tell you what the way he was, because I'm just a biographer, not a preacher or a management consultant.
Do you think that question will be answered with the sort of the luxury of distance and time at some point?
I guess, Clayton Christensen's and other great management gurus could probably do a case study of, you can take all the Jack Welchers and blah, 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 and say, I was, 60 Minutes was saying, wasn't he, did he have to be so hard? Did he have to be so tough? I said, wait a minute, you worked for Don Hewitt. Don Hewitt was a genius. He was also a real pain in the butt. We all know people like that. I guess you could do a study of nice bosses, tough bosses, jerks, whatever, and correlate it somehow with a regression analysis and say who's more successful, but that's way above my pay grade.
Are you writing the screenplay, and would you choose George Clooney?
I am not. I have nothing. The reports of the movie are premature and way overdone, and I'm not even talking about it, but I'm not involved.
Can you see George Clooney in this role at all?
I am not a movie person. In fact, I had trouble when I was dealing with Steve. Steve went over every frame of Pixar movies, the way he went over every chamfer and curve of the first Macintosh. And he would say something about Finding Nemo or whatever, and I remember having to go back and quickly download those movies, because I just don't know. It's one of my blind spots. In fact, when I was editor of Time, I was famous for making really bad movie cover calls. So asking me who should play what in a movie is...
All right, we'll give you a pass on that one. So I'm going to read you the preface that is on this card. It says, on behalf of archivists and historians out there, what were Steve's stipulations about using the interviews you collected for this book, and where will they ultimately be deposited?
Yeah, most of them are notes, some transcripts of the 4 or 5 formal interviews he gave me. My notes will go somewhere. Maybe we should talk, but not for another 20 or 30 years, and not... I mean, partly because Steve, and then the people around Steve, you know, would say things that could be very hurtful, or they'd say, don't you, or they'd, you know, say something just offhanded, especially Steve, about certain things. And the things I didn't put in the book, and the things I would have to take out of those, you know, my notes, just because they were unnecessary to understanding Steve, and probably, you know, in the interest of kindness, you don't want to hurt, you know, people with certain comments. So I will someday go through my notes, and if it's the 20-year rule, maybe some of the things will have, you know, gone by the wayside.
Someone picked up on that quote about great artist Steele and said, he said that, yet he resented Bill Gates and Google and many others for many years for stealing from Apple, as he saw it. How did his Zen self reconcile this?
Steve was not an expert at reconciling conflicting things. Emerson and many others have great quotes about people who can embody conflicting thoughts at the same time. Steve was totally ballistic, first at Bill Gates and Microsoft for ripping off, as he put it, the Macintosh graphical interface. And then, of course, famously berating, and saying it to me in the book with words of one syllable, how he felt Android and Google had ripped off the Apple mobile operating system. You know, did he? No, he didn't try to reconcile that with the fact. But I will say, he didn't rip off Xerox. I mean, there was a financial deal. Xerox invested $1 million in Apple. There was an exchange of technology. I think, you know, he has some right to feel that he came up, or Apple came up, with both the beautiful Macintosh operating system, and then it pretty much is copied by Windows, and likewise the mobile operating system. You can argue, as for 10 years in court, there were an argument about whether you can, you know, copyright or the look and feel, whether there's an intellectual property theft there. But I can understand why he was pissed off.
Given his mercurial, there's a great story in the book about mercurial.
I love the word. Yeah.
And dictatorial style, how was he still able to engender such creativity and loyalty in his work?
First of all, I'll tell the mercurial story, because it's
story.
a part of the self-awareness of Steve, because he was mercurial. And so he's showing off the next computer at Symphony Hall here when it's being unveiled. And among other things, he had helped invent digital books. I mean, they didn't exist, but he put a thesaurus and all of Shakespeare's work in digital form in Next. So he's showing off the thesaurus, and he says, sometimes I'm called mercurial, you know, let me look it up, or whatever. And it says, you know, changeable moods, whatever. And it says antonym, you know, saturnine. And then it describes saturnine as somebody who doesn't have enough emotions, can't... He said, well, maybe it's not so bad to be mercurial, is it? So I think he understood his mercurial nature, and that was a part of who he was. And having said that, I've now forgotten the second half of the question.
Given that he was that way, how did he engender such creativity and loyalty?
Oh, look. When you're creating a machine as insanely great as that, even if you're in the middle of the night saying this code sucks, you got to make it better, by the time you've created, as an engineer, the original Macintosh, you are loyal to the genius and the vision there. And people who have strong personalities either can turn people off, or they can say, hey, I got inspired here and got to be on a team. And look, the proof is, I hate cliches like this, proof being in the pudding, but look at the team he even has at Apple. If he's that bad of a boss, why do so many A players stay with him? Well, because they like to work on a team with only A players. And if he ran off a lot of B players, that doesn't mean that that team at Apple filled with A players, you know, they're quite loyal to him.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs? They both describe each other as close
well, Larry
friends.
says that, you know, best friend. It was, you know, a deep, friendly relationship. One of my favorite anecdotes is, I think, late '96, when the question of Steve coming back to take over Apple is first being kicked around. And Larry Ellison says, why don't we buy Apple? Why don't I launch a hostile takeover? I'll buy Apple, we'll put you back, and it'll set it into motion again, and we'll all make a lot of money. And Steve finally says, I think I might go back to Apple, but I don't want you to invest. I don't want you to buy it. I don't want me to invest. I want to be able to go back at $1 a year and no ownership of it. And Larry Ellison says, but Steve, if you do it and you come back that way and it makes it a great company again, how am I going to make it? How are we going to make money, you know, if we don't invest in it and buy it? And they were walking along a beach, and Steve grabs him by both shoulders and says, Larry, this is why it's important I'm your friend. You don't need any more money. It didn't, well, I won't go there. I'm not doing a
couple more questions. First, well, before I get to those two, let me just ask you quickly about the current technology, this great conversational interface that Siri represents.
Siri.
Did he talk much about that with you?
Yes.
What the vision for that is?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the simplest, most natural interfaces have always been his passion, and there's no simpler one than just talking. I did not know the name Siri, but we talked a little bit, and I was careful in the book, even though he told me a lot of things that in detail, what he wanted to do. I decided, you know, I shouldn't put, you know, in things that he might not be able to do and that Apple may be working on for the next couple of years. But at the last board meeting, when he tenders his resignation as CEO, they have a lunch afterwards. All the engineers bring out the various things that they're working on. And one of them, which I knew would come out pretty soon, so I put in the book, is this voice recognition thing. And I do have Steve try, I mean, they are panicked because they know Steve is not feeling very well, but he's been brought into this meeting that he's going to try to make it look bad. So he asks, you know, what is now called Siri, you know, do I need an umbrella? And tomorrow says, you know, the prediction is for sunny day tomorrow in Palo Alto. So it really is doing the beautiful thing. So finally Steve says, are you a man or are you a woman? And they all kind of hold their breath because, you know, he's trying to trick the machine. And Siri is very good, the 2 layers of it. And it says, they have not yet assigned me a gender. And they all breathe a sigh of relief, and Steve thinks it's great. So he loved that technology. By the way, Bill Gates was always, I mean, everybody's been trying to crack voice recognition.
Yeah. What do you think of the Apple that he leaves behind? You've talked about the team and the great group that he's built. There's rumored to be this product roadmap that goes on and on. But the history of technology companies with a founder like this and someone driving it with a vision like this leaving is not great overall. Mm-hmm. What do you think about where Apple goes from here without Steve Jobs? Well,
at the last meeting I told you about, when he goes to the board and does that lunch, somebody at the lunch makes fun of HP because that day or that week had gotten out of the tablet business, was either getting in or, you know, out of the PC, you know, was totally confused. And Steve said, wait a minute. You know, he stops the person who's making fun of the troubles at Hewlett-Packard. He said, when I was 13, Bill Hewlett gave me my first job. And he and Packard created a company that was imbued with their DNA, that was designed not only to make a calculator and then make a computer and make other things, but to continue and last and continue to make new products and come up with new ideas even after they were gone. And those bozos screwed it up for Hewlett and Packard. I don't want that to happen at Apple. And he tried deeply to fight off the bozo explosion so there was only a great team of A players, but also to say there's a simple thing that Apple stands for, which is the intersection of great creativity in the humanities with great engineering and technology. And he said that's what Disney did. You know, that's what a lot of people have done. There are companies that last. IBM is almost 101 years old. I think Apple has imbued in its genetic code this desire to drive great design and artistic creativity with great design, engineering and technology, and it will be at that intersection. And the people there now are capable of keeping it at that intersection. You know, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, look, Disney goes ups and down, but you still know what Disney stands for, and it's doing fine right now after a few rough patches since Walt Disney died. I would, if I had to wager, and unlike Rick Perry, I am a betting man, not $10,000, but I would wager that a generation from now, even a century from now, Apple will still exist at the intersection of the humanities and the technology.
So that's Apple. Now one final question about Steve Jobs. So 100 years ago, the great industrialists and philanthropists, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Mellon, built institutions as well as corporate legacies, and that legacy survives. Steve Jobs, had he lived longer, might have done the same thing, but he chose not to do it for whatever reason now. And his legacy is Apple, but it's built on a rather shifting sandbar of technology. So 100 years from now, you've talked about what you think Apple will do. What do you think the legacy of Steve Jobs will be as people look back on him in this era?
Well, I did ask him the last 5 or 6 pages of the book is just him talking outright about what's your legacy. It's putting something back in the flow of history after you've built on those who went before you. I asked him what was his greatest creation, thinking maybe it'd be the iPad or whatever. He said, no, Apple the company, because products come and go, but the hard part is making a company that will continue to make good products. So I do think Apple will be his legacy, but also more specifically, the legacy will be somebody who truly transformed industry after industry by pulling together great ideas and driving the technology to support them. I mean, look at the iPad. People made fun of it. I was there when he launched it. There were all sorts of articles. What is it? You know, an iPhone on steroids? Nobody makes a tablet work. The iPad is now, whether I walk into a doctor's office or, you know, anywhere else, it is transforming industry after industry. $2 billion last year just in the industry of creating apps for it. The textbook industry. You know, Carnegie was great with education philanthropy. Bill Gates was great with education philanthropy. In the end, the iPad may change education as much as any of the Carnegie schools. So I think he's got a pretty solid legacy if you look at each of those industries he transformed.
So we often ask our authors to do a short reading at the end, and you graciously agreed to read the coda of the biography. And I wonder if you would do that for us now.
Yeah, thank you. As I said, I'll start earlier on. I do end one more thing, his signature phrase. And I do say biographers are supposed to have the last word, but this is one of Steve Jobs. And even though he didn't impose his legendary control, I suspect I would not be conveying the right feel for him and the way he asserted himself into any situation if I just shuffled him on history's stage without letting him have some of the last words. So I really take a series of interviews I did with him about his legacy and just let him talk without me getting in the way. But then the coda is about one sunny afternoon when in the back garden of his house he wasn't feeling well, and he reflected on death. And I say he talked about his experiences in India almost 4 decades earlier, his study of Buddhism, his views on reincarnation, and his views on spiritual transcendence. Quote, "I'm about 50-50 on believing in God," he said. "For most of my life, I've felt there must be more to our existence than meets the eye," unquote. He admitted that as he faced death, he might be overestimating the odds out of a desire to believe in the afterlife. Quote, "I like to think that something survives after you die. It's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom, and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures." And then he fell silent for a long time. And then he said, "But on the other hand, perhaps it's just like an on-off switch," he said. Click, you die, you're gone. And then he paused again, a long pause, and he smiled slightly. Quote, "And maybe that's why I never like to put on-off switches on Apple devices." That's the end.
This event was hosted by the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. To find out more, visit computerhistory.org.